Kia ora koutou. My name is Nick Holm, and it's my pleasure and my honor to be invited to give this keynote, one of these keynote presentations for the meeting of the AHSN conference. Now, we had a bit of a mishap on the day itself, which meant that my presentation wasn't recorded, so I've been asked to do it again. This is about my fifth take at this attempt. Let's see if I can get it right this time. Laughter can change the world. Well, it would be really helpful, not to mention politically advantageous if it could. If comedy could overcome oppression and tear down exploitative regimes. If jokes could set us free. After all, not only are the forms of culture that give rise to laughter widespread and accessible, they also tend to be both pleasurable to both produce and consume, although there are certainly exceptions. On that basis, if properly harnessed, an effective politics of humour would seem to hold out the potential to build a better society in ways that are not only inclusive, but maybe even enjoyable. Given this potential then, it's a little wonder that popular humour has become a site of repeated and profound investment regarding the power of cultural forms to enact meaningful change in the world. This belief in the transformative power of the comic is especially apparent in relation to that loose category usually referred to as satire, a term that once named a particular technical genre, but which in its current usage tends to inform a more general claim about comic texts. Long since loosened from any precise definition, the category of satire is now more commonly evoked to describe forms of humour that are thought to manifest critical intention, to name a mode of comedy with the intention or the potential to change the world. Indeed, in the 21st century, this idea of satire has become a central concept by which to assess and address the political potential of humour, a key term that orientates both the study and the production of comedy as a matter of more than just jokes. In popular culture, the centrality of satire has been cemented by the rise of what Robert Fiddian has referred to as the satirical industrial complex, which has given rise to a global glut of self-ascribed satirical media content, from animated comedy to the political turn in stand-up, to US late-night television and its international derivatives, to the ever-expanding wealth of online comment and criticism couched in comic terms. In this environment, it seems increasingly difficult to find instances of humour that do not seek to lay claim to the mantle of satire on some level. Elsewhere, the satirical turn of popular comedy has been matched by commensurate developments in the theoretical and philosophical literature on the topic, which has sought to both explain and announce the potential of humour to carry out political work. In doing so, such research has evoked a wide range of philosophers and cultural theorists, most frequently Mikhail Bakhtin, but also less obvious thinkers of the comic, like Georges Hegel, Gilles Deleuze, and even the famously dour Theodore Adorno. Beyond adding an invaluable touch of intellectual gravitas, such reference points have also served to connect the contemporary discussion of satire to an older and wider tradition, one that's historically been known by multiple names, including cultural politics, cultural Marxism, avant-gardism, or political aesthetics. Regardless of the name, though, what these intellectual projects have to share in common is a concern with culture's ability to enact political praxis. Most fully developed under the sign of modernism, this dream of cultural politics seeks to make of cultural expression a form of political and social revolution by means other than barricades and palace putches. Genuinely popular, effectively engaging, and frequently deeply cutting, satire promises the possibility to achieve meaningful and measurable social and political change by way of cultural forms. However, what I want to suggest this morning is that despite the popular and scholarly enthusiasm that is attracted, satire is not and cannot be the combination of cultural politics that it's often made out to be. Indeed, I think a fixation on satire has prevented a more thorough and useful reckoning with the relationship between humour and politics. To develop this position, in this talk, I'm going to attempt to situate the contemporary conversation regarding satire in terms of the wider historical sweep of cultural political thinking. I'm going to do this as a way to provide a more thorough account of how satire's politics function in historically specific ways. Locating satire in terms of this theoretical trajectory allows us to better perceive how the apparent power of satire can work to limit, rather than expand, our ability to account for the multiple ways in which cultural forms can do political work. And We're going to argue that this is because the idea of satire reifies the relationship between culture and politics. Ultimately, then, what I'm going to suggest is that it's only when we recognize the limitations of satirical critique that it becomes possible to attend in more productive ways to how not only humor, but culture more broadly can act upon the world. But before we get to that, share screen, I think it's important to first step back and reflect upon how humor has been increasingly embraced as a popular and legitimate means by which to cover, analyze, and intervene in politics in our early 21st century. On the one hand, we have the popular success and cultural resonance of political comedy, ranging from the snide documentary showmanship of Michael Moore to the laughter-laden news coverage of The Daily Show under first Jon Stewart and then Trevor Noah, which is not to mention the show's multiple imitators and inheritors. We also have the deadpan absurdities of The Onion, Armando Iannucci's political comedies of error, the last gasps of the political cartooning tradition, and the seemingly never-ending deluge of politically tinted stand-up comedy. And I'm sure you folks in Australia could also add some local examples to that set. Moreover, such professional output through legacy media channels is these days absolutely swamped by the upswell of online content. We can see this in terms of both anonymous, unchecked political memes and GIFs, and with the emergence of new forms of more professional political entertainment, most prominently perhaps comedy political podcasts, such as Abe Lincoln's Top Hat or Chapo Trap House. Despite the sometimes predicted end of political satire, the popular appetite for comic comment on politics seems to show little sign of slowing, even as its expression shifts to better fit the advantages and affordances offered by these new media forms. Now, let's just stop there. Now, on the other hand, the 21st century has also been witness to an ever-narrowing gap between comedians and politicians proper. This can be seen in the increasing willingness of prominent politicians to engage with and even indulge in comic performances. For instance, in the US, there was Barack Obama's multiple appearances on late-night comedy shows. There's Donald Trump's embrace of mockery and ridicule as political tactics, and Joe Biden's cultivation of an avuncular, folksy persona. This tendency also finds expression in the slightly unnerving rise of the comedian politician. Most prominent in this regard is Volodymyr Zelensky, who played the starring role in the Ukrainian sitcom Sloga Naroda, Servant of the People, in which a high school teacher is unexpectedly elected to the position of president of the Ukraine. This was before he himself was actually elected to that same position as a leader of a political party sharing the name of his show. Furthermore, while Zelensky might be the most striking example, he's far from alone. Other comedian politicians of note include John Maher of Iceland, Al Franken in the USA, Beppe Grillo of Italy, and the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, whose previous role as a waggish pundit directly informs his political career as a libertine buffoon. No longer, then, would a lack of seriousness appear to be a meaningful barrier to electoral success. Indeed, there appears to be a certain advantage to be obtained from the injection of joviality into matters of state. What we can see in these instances, then, is that across multiple constituencies and cultures, humor has become an increasingly accepted way to conduct, discuss, and do politics. Around the world, comedy has been embraced and even celebrated as an important, popular, and legitimate means by which to engage in politics. Moreover, this is true not only in the US and Anglophone contexts, where the latest versions of culture wars rage on in their new comic shapes, but also can be seen in places like China, where subtle comedy has informed attempts by social media users to express political discontent. For example, as was widely reported in 2018, Chinese censors sought to remove all references to Winnie the Pooh from the Chinese corners of the internet, after the character was adopted as a mocking stand-in for President Xi Jinping. The larger point here is that humor now seems to be everywhere all the time as an expected aspect of political conduct. It would seem indeed that we've entered into a new golden age of political humor. And although the Trump presidency gave rise to some concern regarding the limitations of comedy as a form of political action, the predominant response to the ongoing satire boom seems to have remained largely celebratory, with the politics of humor hailed as simultaneously subversive, accessible, and entertaining. No longer restricted to the educated or even to the especially engaged, politically inclined humor renders critique an enjoyable activity, and thereby is often figured to expand the public appetite for detailed engagement with political questions and debates. Key advocates of such an approach to humour include media and communications scholars such as Geoffrey P. Jones, Amber Day, Jonathan Rossing, and James Caron, as well as those like John Worrell and Simon Critchley, who have influentially framed humour's political potential in broader philosophical terms. And this is a perspective that finds its perhaps most perfect expression in the oft-cited Mark Twain quotation that, against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand. Nor is this approach to humour restricted to the academy. It also informs wider popular attitudes towards the politics of humour, assumptions about what Alenka Supanzik refers to as the humanist romantic presentation of comedy as intellectual resistance. Indeed, so popular is this new mode of comic critique that in many contexts it threatens to supplant the suspiciously somber forms of ideology critique by which power has been previously interrogated. There seems to be increasingly little time or taste for solemn denunciations and deconstructions of whatever political ills against one wishes to take aim. Instead, almost everywhere, a little laughter would seem to go a long way. Now, this account of humour provided up to this point can be understood to align with a long-standing desire that I refer to in the title of this talk as the dream of cultural politics. This dream aspires to a form of cultural conception, production, or performance that is able to bring about change in the lived reality of everyday life related to the distribution and experience of power. In different manifestations, this dream has been an important aspect of the production and study of culture since at least the turn of the 20th century. From the artistic experimentation of the various modernist avant-gardes to the libidinous aspirations of 1960s rock and the politics of noise, from the defamiliarization of the Russian formalists to the critical aesthetic theory of the Frankfurt School, to Raymond Williams' cultural materialism, critical feminism, queer theory, and other iterations of critical cultural studies. What unites these disparate intellectual, artistic, and scholarly projects is a belief that cultural works in themselves, in their formal properties, rather than just their representative content, that these works can do things, political things, that they can reach beyond themselves as texts to enact change in the world. The mechanism by which this reaching beyond becomes possible has been understood in multiple ways. For some, this process is primarily cognitive, for others, affective. At times, the natural medium for this influence is the interiority of the individual. For others, it is by necessity, the structures and systems of a shared society. At the dawn of the 20th century, the futurist Francisco Marinetti, who you can see here, articulated the power of art as a violent assault upon the forces of the unknown with the intention of making them prostrate themselves at the feet of mankind. While a few years later, Vasily Kandinsky hailed the transformative power of art in more gentle, explicitly spiritual terms. Elsewhere, Viktor Shklovsky of the Russian formalists said that art could shape the world through a process of ostranenie, or defamiliarization, whereby the play of form and the difficulty of expression could thwart the habitualization of perception. And even somewhere else, Martin Heidegger looked towards art's capacity to found a new world that would engender a state of existential disorientation akin to the uncanny awareness of one's own death. Whew. Such thinkers, although varied in their specific concerns, shared a common belief that when properly executed in terms of technique, composition, and motivation, formal art had the power to transform minds and thereby to transform the world. However, it's in the work of those theorists and philosophers who come to be known as Western or cultural Marxists that the most fully developed account of the political function of culture has been articulated. Marxist intellectuals such as Georges Lukács, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, Henri Lefebvre, and Theodore Adorno contributed substantially to a theoretical language and framework for making sense of the social and political power of art, which for them was tied up with its conditional autonomy from its context of production. In this framework, art's potential to prize out a space of critical distance from its capitalist context allowed it to express uncomfortable truths about the exploitative ways of the world. This work then provides the foundation for a later generation of political aesthetic theorists, people like Raymond Williams, Michel de Certeau, Linda Hutchin, Guy Debord, and Stuart Hall, who would then expand that theoretical project to increasingly encompass popular and everyday forms of culture in a variety of ways. Sometimes culture was envisioned as an expression of the popular will or as raw material for oppositional tactics. At other times, it became the very terrain on which power struggles could take place. And then, most recently, in the wake of disenchantment with some of the more radical claims made for the political power of the popular, affect now emerges as a predominant site for conceiving the potential of culture to impact upon the world. And this is expressed in the work of a new generation of aesthetic theorists such as Laurent Balance, Jan Nagai, and Ben Highmore. Regardless of emphasis, though, what this work continues to explore is how to make sense of the ways that cultural products might have a bearing upon the world, how culture might do politics. And my reason for indulging in this admittedly very brief and only partial history of cultural political thought is because I think it's important to begin to reconnect the critical claims often made on behalf of humour with this longer history of cultural politics. Too often, discussions of the politics of humour take place as if they reflected a hitherto unimagined form of political praxis. The idea that culture can act as a political intervention is not new, and contemporary claims for the politics of humour echo this long tradition, even when they're not aware of it. The power of humour to reveal the lurking nonsense and the habitual aspects of our social lives, to provide a basis for new affiliations and communities, to reshape our emotional orientation toward our society. All of this marks continuation, rather than a break, with the history of cultural political thought. Too often, though, this continuity is overlooked because of the prevalence of a different idea that offers to organise and explain the politics of humour. And this is the idea of satire, a key term for understanding humour as an accepted and expected aspect of politics in the early 21st century. For those concerned with exploring the relationship between culture and politics, one of the most obvious and apparent paths available to us today leads through satire. The concept not only offers a way of making sense of how an aesthetic and cultural category like humour could do political work, but also it seemingly holds out the promise of something even more significant, an actually existing example of a properly critical form of contemporary culture in action. So be it John Oliver's laughter-laden calls to political action on Last Week Tonight, Michelle Wolf's controversial speaking of comic truth to power at the 2018 White House Correspondents' Dinner, or Jon Stewart's earlier role as America's comic conscience during the Bush administration, satirists have become ever more central to contemporary politics, both in the US and around the world. Share screen somehow. When considered alongside a well-documented and widely distributed sense of general political disenfranchisement, fears regarding waning social solidarity, and the ongoing global consequences of economic inequality, not to mention the pandemic, the utopian promise of satire appears as a rare glimmer of hope, a widely consumed, popular expression of political critique that promises to, in the words of Jonathan Gray, Jeffrey Jones, and Ethan Thompson, encapsulate public sentiment, energize civic culture, and engage citizen audiences. In doing this sort of work, satire promises to realize a particularly compelling vision of cultural politics, whereby meaningful and measurable change is enacted through the production, circulation, and consumption of culture. More than simply the delivery of comically sweetened political messages, satire here appears as an aesthetic practice wherein the formal comic arrangement of a work is central to the employment and expression of its political purpose. And at the very least, this is a very seductive story about the power of popular humour properly wielded to challenge politics as usual. It's certainly a story that has captured the attention and indeed the affections of many scholars of both historical and contemporary humour, while also aligning with what appears to be a genuinely popular opinion. But my question today then is, does that satirical paradigm actually adequately account for the politics of humour at our particular historical moment? After all, if satire is not only the inheritor, but possibly even the realization of the dream of cultural politics, we might wonder why then, in these satirical times, our political world seems to be tending in general in a different and less desirable direction. This can be seen not least with the surge of global nationalisms and forms of prejudice long since thought abandoned. It can also be seen in the increasingly aggressive monitoring of the correct bounds and forms of comic speech in both mediated and private conversation and communication, and in the use of legal and police powers to prosecute humorists from Turkey to Kenya, Hong Kong to Egypt to Russia. If satire is being not only consumed, but also produced and shared by millions, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world, then how might we explain what appears to be the decline or even the defeat of critical thought and emancipatory politics? If satire has the power to do so much, then why does it seem to have done so little? One of the more frequent answers to this question is that satire has done nothing because it can do nothing. It is impotent as a form of political action, a perspective that's often summed up through the evocation of Peter Cook's quip regarding those wonderful Berlin cabarets which did so much to stop the rise of Hitler and prevent the outbreak of the Second World War. As an example of argument by quotation, this is sort of the antithesis to the Twain quotation regarding the assault of laughter, which I raised earlier. But like the Twain quote, I find this ultimately a bit empty. It's sort of an argument by celebrity authority. This is not least because it falls back on the common sense liberal presumption that culture actually can't and doesn't do anything beyond entertainment and escapism. But it does it without actually making any sort of case for that position. On slightly more stable ground, there have also been a number of empirical studies conducted that purport to capture the null effect of satire by showing textual examples of subjects and then measuring their lack of change in political position. However, I'd raise a note of concern regarding the method of this research, to the extent that it seems to presume that before being shown a representative clip of Trevor Noah, that its subjects are somehow free from satirical thinking, as if they weren't already soaking in it, by virtue of being members of a society besotted with the idea of satire. It's like showing a sexist ad to people on the presumption they hadn't seen anything like it before. What such studies can't get at, what they necessarily miss in an archetypal wood for the trees situation, are the wider consequences of political life in a satirical society. This is not the effect of exposure of a given individual to a single instance of satire, but rather the consequences of living in a society absolutely shot through with satirical humor. Now, in order to explain further what I mean by this, I need to now turn to an exercise I've left off till now, establishing more precisely what it is we talk about when we talk about satire. Although there have historically been a degree of variation and even ambiguity regarding the definition of satire, the term has been consistently understood to name a form of cultural expression that criticizes. For example, in his classic work, The Art of Satire, David Worcester argues that the content of satire is criticism. Leonard Feinberg asserts in Intro to Satire that whatever else satirists do, they criticize. And in Arthur Pollard's Satire, he also declares that satire always has a victim, it always criticizes. Such authors and opinions are representative of a long-standing consensus regarding the social, cultural, and political function of satire that was codified during an intense period of scholarly activity in the 1960s. Drawing upon an established canon of satirical writers from Juvenal to Jonathan Swift, authors of this period traced satire as a particularly literary historical form, characterized by a limited, restricted set of techniques and specific generic features. So although more narrowly conceived than contemporary usage due to a focus on what was called formal verse satire, even in this restricted form, satire was nonetheless understood as fundamentally constituted by the intermixture of jest and judgment. Now, more recent scholarship has built upon this earlier definition to take into account the emergence of a broader range of cultural forms that do not adhere to the strict formal arrangements of those literary precedents, but are nonetheless understood as satire. This contemporary reformulation expands upon the traditional definition in order to account for how satire manifests beyond this narrow field of literature, and instead across a range of media forms, things like editorial cartoons, TV programs, and social media posts. As a result of the expansion of potential satirical media and its forms, contemporary scholars of satire tend to argue that it no longer functions as a clearly defined genre, but instead is better understood as a mode or a tone that modifies other forms of expression rather than constituting a set body of cultural works in itself. So we're moving from the noun satire to the adjective satirical. Moreover, when satire makes its transition from a limited range of literary forms to this breadth of popular media, its meaning also tends to lose some of that rigidity and clarity as regards its moral, political, critical function. Contrary to traditional models, the satirist in this contemporary sense need not operate in a world of clear standards and boundaries, but rather can lampoon and provoke without suggesting preferable alternatives. At the same time, Although historically satire was not thought to be necessarily humorous, in practice, contemporary usage of the term tends to privilege humor as a constituent element. Satire is therefore no longer seen as simply a tool of comic moral instruction in prose, but becomes applied to any instance of humor that potentially speaks to political or social political matters. Following the decline of its traditional limited definition, satire thus appears to be now broadly understood as a form of humor that does more than simply provoke laughter, but instead that reaches beyond itself to articulate a point regarding its wider social or political context. Now, and while the lack of clear formal cues has led some to argue that satire remains difficult to define as a cultural form, this is usually only meant in the sense of a difficulty in identifying any clearly delimited set of techniques. Indeed, in the absence of those particular formal cues, the idea that satire is essentially defined by the commingling of comic pleasure and politics has become ever more central to the use and meaning of that term. In general usage, satire thus no longer names a specific set of formal qualities, nor even a particular critical purpose. Rather, what I want to suggest is that it comes to refer to a manifestation of humor that is explicitly orientated towards ends and concerns beyond amusement. In other words, it names humor that ought to be taken seriously. However, if satire names a form of humor that ought to be taken seriously, then this presumes the existence of another sort of humor against which satire needs to be distinguished. Humor which does not reach beyond itself, which is not political, and which therefore need not be taken seriously. This definition of satire as a meaningful and serious mode of humor therefore calls into being a residual category of ostensibly purposeless humor that fails to meet the criteria of critique or commitment, what we might think of as the merely comic or the just joking. Most of you will have your own personal example of what such humor might look like. Typical examples could include the Big Bang Theory, Mrs. Brown's Boys, Friends, the eternal punching bag of punning, all of which frequently serve to illustrate a mode of the comic that lacks ethical or political weight. It's this distinction that informs the work of David Waters's statement that, quote, the laughter of comedy is relatively purposeless, the laughter of satire is directed towards a preconceived end, where comedy comes to name this broader purposeless humor. This distinction is also important to Dieter de Klerk's argument that satire needs to be distinguished from what he refers to as non-satiric frivolous mockery, a term he uses to describe the comedy of British panel shows that, although they might take the business of politics as a subject for jokes, do not seek to make any particular critical point. And we can make a similar observation about late night comedy in the US, which fills a very similar niche in the local comedy ecosystem. What this opposition helps clarify then is that satire is no longer a highly specific generic form of critical prose. Go backwards, please. Instead, the term comes to serve a more fundamental social function. It acts as a convenient working distinction between cultural texts that are social and political and those that are not. In the context of our satirical century, satire emerges as a heroic and engaged mode of humor defined against the backdrop of detached, apolitical silliness. However, and it's a big however, my contention is not that satire ought to be understood as an exceptionally political form of humor. Instead, I want to argue the opposite, that when satirical critique is evoked as the ultimate expression of the politics of humor, that this shuts down a full reckoning with the complexity and diversity of the ways that not just humor, but all culture can do politics. And this is the point I want to work through in the final stages of my talk, how satire is not the realization of the dream of cultural politics, but rather its denial, and how this can explain why the satire boom has failed to usher in anything approaching a political golden age. Now, at the core of my argument here is the concept of reification, as developed most influentially in the work of George Lukács and expanded upon in the work of Frederick Jameson. Reification refers to a process whereby social relations, activities, and categories become understood as objective things in themselves, rather than as the products of human behavior. So this process is predicated on the extension of the abstract logic of the commodity form, which mistakes relations between objects for relations between people, and the extension of this logic to society and subjectivity more broadly. In doing so, reification rationalizes and reduces the ways that we understand and interact with the world, and makes it into a matter of distinct, durable, and discrete social and psychological units. So rather than understanding our social environment as a more contingent, complicated dynamic, and above all, deeply interconnected assemblage. Following Lukács, Jamieson argues that it is this process of conceptual calcification that prevents the bourgeoisie from grasping society as a whole, and which consequently compels capitalist thought to grasp the world as a collection of separate fields and disciplines. So, for example, I think this is most apparent in academic terms, where it's this idea of reified thinking that underpins the distinctions we draw between, say, economics, sociology, arts, and psychology, as if the economic could be ever thought separate from the social, or the cultural from the psychological, or any combination of the above. The suggestion that satire reifies cultural politics is thus a way of saying that it reduces the complicated dynamic and above all else human terrain of cultural politics into a set of stable categories, fossilized relationships, and rote moves. And absolutely central to this reifying process is the foundation of those separate stable categories of satire and mere humour, which I raised earlier. This act of partitioning between satire and mere humour is premised on more than just a series of differences in formal expression, but rather operates via a politically meaningful distinction between what it thereby establishes as two separate domains of culture. One where politics takes place, and another where it does not. In doing so, satirical thinking actually reproduces the wider structural pattern of a reified society, wherein it's presumed that culture and culturally forms should normally be understood as distinct from politics. Satire reproduces what usually appears as the common sense distinction between politics and culture, and reproduces this within culture itself, and more specifically within the sphere of comedy. When satire makes a claim for its own status as politically meaningful, it does so on the basis that it should be an exception to the general tendency. And what this means is that satire's claim for political status is premised on the assertion that other forms of humour are not meaningfully political. Consequently, the celebration of satire as a privileged side of politics comes at the expense of the vast remainder of mere humour, and beyond that, mere culture, that is thereby consigned to the apolitical realm of unimportant entertainment. In doing so, the reification of satire sets it apart from other forms of humour. It makes of political comic practice a special and exceptional case, rather than a familiar aspect of everyday humour in all its forms. So transformed, satire is well on its way to becoming something apart, a vocation and a marketing category, a division of labour that separates out comic critique as a particular skill possessed by the specific few as a basis for industry and profit, rather than as something we all share in common by virtue of being human. In this way, satire entangles humour's critical qualities with the semi-industrial logics of production and mediation, and separates them from everyday practice. Satire, that is to say politically meaningful humour, thereby becomes no longer something that regular people do themselves, but rather something that we only experience and consume. Furthermore, this account of satire as a particular style or sensibility does not exhaust the implications of satire as a form of reification. Instead, to fully grasp how satire undermines cultural politics, we need to also consider how the concept operates in structural terms. And what I mean by this is the question of how satire imagines a particular arrangement of textual relationships, which takes us back to its foundational division, that between culture and politics. The relationship between these two spheres in relation to satire has been most fully theorized in the American comms and media studies tradition by the aforementioned human studies scholars like Karen, Day, Jones, Rossing, and Jeffrey Bain, where satire is overwhelmingly characterized as a scandalous and maybe even subversive intrusion of the cultural, specifically the comic, into the serious domain of politics. Thus intruded, satire is imagined to wreak a form of progressive havoc, unsettling dogma, upending hierarchy, etc., etc. I imagine many of you are very familiar with this story. It's the assault of laughter that I referred to earlier. So in this account, the political promise of satire is realized through the transgression of the otherwise inviolate barrier between the separate worlds of popular entertainment and serious politics. Satire is seen to perform its fundamental politics by transgressing the line that would normally keep the political separate from the popular and from the cultural. And for those who would normally experience the division between pop culture and politics as a clear, common sense and normative distinction, the satirical subversion of that boundary appears as a radical act. Satire is a utopian form, able to overcome the partition between political action and cultural consumption, and thereby render cultural practices immediately and meaningfully political. And in doing so, satire appears to be doing the same work that underpins the longer tradition of cultural politics I raised earlier. It dismantles the assumed gap between culture and politics as separate realms, de-reifying our lives by comic means. And I guess if I would leave off the argument here, it would thus appear that satire ultimately opposes rather than enacts reification, because it acknowledges the continuity between cultural and political aspects of life. However, and this is another big however, this conclusion is unfortunately premature, insofar as it does not consider the aforementioned ways in which satire shapes that relationship, that broader relationship between itself and other forms of pop culture. While satire may gesture towards the possibility of doing politics with culture, it does so while simultaneously presenting its own such interventions as exceptional. It does so by defining itself against that backdrop of mere humour. According to this logic, then, while satirical humour can transcend this ostensible gap between the spheres of politics and mere entertainment, it does so on the assumption that the two are otherwise kept properly separate. Satire only appears as a radical challenge to the status quo on the basis that politics and culture should otherwise be regarded as incommensurate separate categories. The claim that satirized humour doing politics is premised on the assumption that humour may not be political in any other way. Satire's conscious and explicit engagement is established as the only viable manifestation of a political pop culture. The popular politics of satire and the comic scandal of the non-serious treatment of political issues are thus orientated against a broader politics of humour in a manner that works to contain and mitigate the wider promises of cultural politics. Satire takes all the oxygen from the room of cultural politics, as it were, because it challenges the structural divisions between culture and politics only as a provocation, rather than as a revelation of their deeper continuity. The dominance of satirical thinking, then, does more than just create a reified distinction between political and mere humour. It enacts a premature shutdown of any broader reckoning with the political work of humour. And it does this by classifying as political only that humour which actively declares its commitment or criticism. Satire's declaration that it is doing politics is founded on the denial that culture may be political in other ways. Consequently, the ascendance of satire limits the ways in which we can think about how humour can be political, reduces the politics of humour to the narrowest sense of rhetoric, and ignores the wider possibilities of affective, ideological, or aesthetic forms of politics of humour. The ascendancy of satire is both a popular form and a theoretical lens for making sense of the politics of humour, ultimately and prematurely reduces our ability to understand the diverse, subtle, and more powerful ways that humour can do politics. The popular politics of satire thus obscures a vital theoretical point. That in many meaningful ways, the cultural and the political are always connected. And it's in this deeper connection that the true and potentially less desirable, uglier, more reactionary politics of humour lie. Or to put it another way, satire is the reification of cultural politics. It's a transformation of cultural politics into a preordained, pre-given thing, rather than a process of struggle and ongoing development. The idea of satire prematurely shuts down the possibility of those grander utopian visions that have historically emerged from a confrontation between aesthetics and politics. Thus, even when it aspires to meaningful critique, satire's ultimate legacy is to burn the bridge of cultural politics behind itself. This failure to properly characterize the cultural politics of satire is a consequence of what I think of as an insufficiently dialectical approach, one that emphasizes the critical at the expense of the ideological aspects of the form. This critical fission constitutes the promise of the real and indeed fully visceral pleasure of utopian transformation that underpins the appeal of satire. But satire is not simply critique. It is also the fantasy of critique, that would be possible if we had not divorced culture, comedy included, from politics in general. And without a more abstract shift in cultural political consciousness, satire is only capable of functioning at an aesthetic level, where political and social critique becomes the impetus for humor, something that can be resolved through amusement. What Frederick Jameson calls, writing in a very different context, I might add, a predicted solution on the aesthetic or imaginary level to a genuinely contradictory situation in the concrete world of real life. And in this way, I want to suggest satire works not as a realization of the politics of humor, but rather as a premature closure of how the politics of humor, indeed the politics of humor in general, might be understood. So, whereas advocates of satire imagine it as a critical cultural form advocates of satire imagine it as a critical cultural form capable of affecting social and political change when it's properly wielded. From that perspective, the lack of concrete change caused by satire is just a problem of execution rather than conception. However, what I've sought to argue in this talk is that the failure of satire to instigate political change is not the result of a failure of application, but rather is an expression of the underlying logic of the form as it currently exists. Satire's political failure isn't a bug, it's a feature, because its claim to be a form of political critique is predicated on a denial of any deeper connection between politics and pop culture, between politics and everyday life. It's for this reason that the ascendance of satire as both a concept and a form should not be considered a moment of triumph for the dream of political culture, but rather a troubling and ongoing challenge for those who are concerned with the broader idea, the broader dream perhaps, of a politics of culture in general, and in particular, a politics of humor. Thanks.